with his speech entitled The Real Legacy. Please welcome Faulkner.
Mr. Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters, most welcome guests. About 5 years ago, a lady called Mrs. Smith brought her dog called Endeavour, honestly, into my surgery. And I remember it well because we had been talking casually about the South Indian Ocean tsunami, where about 200,000 plus people died. And I remembered it this week because, of course, the incident in Haiti, where about 200 plus thousand people have also died. And I always remember Mrs. Smith's philosophical summing up before we started looking at Endeavour. She said, "Oh well, these things happen, nothing we can do about it, I guess time heals all wounds." Now she wasn't meaning to be insensitive, but you could sense it certainly wasn't affecting her day. So I started looking at Endeavour and I said, "So what can I do for you?" She said, "Well, he's been scratching for about a week now. And when someone gives us a symptom, I start thinking, okay, causes of scratching, start putting them into categories, so I start thinking and filtering. Scratching dogs equals parasites, allergies, skin infections. About 60% of the scratching dogs we see are caused by parasites, and about 55 of that 60% are caused by fleas. In other words, just over half the dogs we see that are scratching are somehow related to fleas." So I started talking to her about this and said, asked her, "Have you fleed him recently?" It's a question that we asked. Now, sensing the reaction that we were going to get from her, she said, "As most people in Britain say, and I've experienced this the length and the breadth of the country, from it's nae fleas, Ken, or it's not fleas the nose, or it's not fleas, young man," as the lady from Woodbridge said. I was very pleased to be called young man. In fact, I actually think she's the last person who's called me young man. So, sensing that if I was to make a diagnosis of fleas, I might need some slightly more robust evidence, as we chatted, I casually groomed through Endeavour's coat with my comb. And much to her horror and disgust, 4 fleas wriggled and danced along the comb. Now, Mrs. Smith's reaction was an extreme version of what I've seen many times in my consulting room when I make a diagnosis, a conclusive diagnosis of fleas. Shame, devastation, embarrassment. She went red and almost cried. Now, remember, this is the person who about 3 minutes earlier had said, "Well, it's one of those things when 200,000 people die." So why is it that we British react so violently to the diagnosis of fleas? Is it because they make us scratch? Maybe. See a few flea-infested flea bags. But I suggest it's actually something different than that. It's actually because it's in our psyche that fleas equals disease equals plague. I'm sure you'll remember from your history lessons the bubonic plague back in the 14th century killed about 2.5 million people of British population. And the Great Plague back in the 17th century killed a mere 100,000. And as a legacy, fleas are a bad thing. And I've seen this before. Growing up in Northern Ireland, I've seen another disproportionate emotional reaction to something that's embedded in the cultural psyche. So, I grew up on a farm, and one of the things we grew was potatoes. And therefore I got exposed to seeing lots of people who grew and worked with potatoes. But let me tell you a few things about potatoes. Potatoes in Ireland are a tangible manifestation of Ireland's very soul. They're about the only thing that actually grows in our wet, putrid climate at times that actually is a staple diet for the nation. And also, they're singularly responsible for making Ireland probably the most distributed people in the world. We never got in our table topics to what's the best thing about Australia. Well, the best thing about Australia is the Irish cricket team. There are more people who live in America who claim to be Irish than actually are Irish themselves. So, what's that got to do with spots? Well, in about the 19th century, you maybe didn't do Irish history, in about 1845, the potato blight hit Ireland. And it just tested out to first, and then came back for the next 3 years and totally decimated the Irish potato crop. Now, the relevance of this was Ireland lived off potatoes. It is said that the average working man would have consumed about 6.5 kilograms of potatoes every single day. So let me just put that into perspective. That's 2 kilograms, 2 kilograms, and 2 kilograms. That's breakfast, that's lunch, and that's evening tea, every single day. And it's totally fine, you can live off it. And with a little bit of buttermilk, which supplements vitamin A, and some missing essential fats, you can live off that quite healthily your whole life. But the potato blight absolutely decimated the Irish. They reckon about 1 million people out of the 8 million population died of starvation, and about 1.5 million people emigrated. About 1 million of them never emigrated anywhere. They never made it. That's almost as many people as killed with the fleas during the bubonic plague. So, when I was home and I was growing up, and I saw this old boy once digging his spots, okay? He was digging his garden, digging his spots, he was like fussing them out, and he would be sorting through them and getting them ones, chucking them in the bucket, and every now and again, he would pick one up, he would throw it down, and in a really bad case, he would cross himself. And I was perplexed, and I said to my dad, what's that about? And he said, he's cursing the blight. And he's actually cursing the English who didn't look after them during the famine as well. But he's cursing the blight as had been passed down during generations. Because it was still in the psyche that it meant so much to them. So, what does this all mean? Is there any significance? Maybe he was just worried he was going to lose his lunch. Maybe the English just don't like to itch. Maybe there is some significance in it. Maybe it's not a coincidence that the one man during the 80s who felt motivated more than any other on the planet to sort out the African famine was an Irishman. Maybe it's a coincidence. Maybe it was a legacy of our family. Anyway, it all got me to thinking about Haiti today. And I was thinking, I wonder what the legacy will be from the earthquakes and the catastrophe we've had in the last week. I wonder what little cultural legacies we'll see in hundreds of years' time. Too much of a stretch? Well, if you remember, Haiti is the country that still practices voodoo, a legacy they brought from their West African ancestors over 350 years ago to help them cope with the trials and tribulations of slavery, and they still practice it today. So too far-fetched? I don't know. But all I wonder, maybe, like Mrs. Smith says, time will heal all wounds, but I wonder what wounds will be underneath the surface in a few centuries to come.